Greetings. Thank you for joining us on my channel. My name is Sean Mixon. I am the thought decoder and the director of Reasonable Faith Dallas. Today, I am joined with Mr. Allen from Reasonable Faith at UTD, and we are bringing you a very special discussion today, discussing doubt. And Mr. Allen, could you introduce yourself and the guest that we have today?
Thanks a lot, Sean. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on your channel here. I met Sean recently. We lead different reasonable faith groups here in the Dallas area, which is kind of exciting. And I brought up the idea of bringing on a friend of mine, Devin, who's going to share a bit about his story, which is somewhat like my own as far as going through a period of doubts, a real crisis of faith. And he's still working through the journey, but he has a lot of interesting things to share. And what I really appreciate about Devin is that he has spent a lot of time researching, and he's taken the bull by the horn, so to speak. He's really looking for evidence to inform his decision. I think in that sense, it's very commendable how he's approached the journey and the big questions of life. A bit about Devin. He, like myself, has a software company, and he has a background in physics, has a degree in physics. And so when I first met him at an atheist Christian book club, we found that we seemed to have a lot in common and really hit it off well. So we started meeting and talking through things, and I've gotten to know him pretty well. And he's a great guy. So I thought it'd be fun to have him come on and share his story. He actually has a blog that's fairly recently come out called Suddenly Adrift that I highly recommend. So we'd love to connect with people out there that are searching for God, no matter where you are in that search. If you're very skeptical, but you're open to evidence, or if you're maybe a Christian, but you're kind of struggling with one or two areas of doubt, that's also someone who could benefit, I think, from looking at Devin's blog. So anyway, I'd like to turn it over then to Devin. Can you share a bit about your story and your background? When did you start having doubts, and what was that like, Devin?
Well, basically what was going on is I was rapidly approaching my 50th birthday. I'm born in December, so I was going into the month of August, and literally overnight, I had a crisis of faith. So through my whole life, I had always kind of thought of myself a little bit of a Peter Pan kind of guy, right? You know, I understand logically that everyone gets older, that should have been evidenced by, the tasks like raking leaves that should not have invoked the aches and pains that they did, and the little wrinkles and the gray hair. You can't tell, but because that's courtesy of my wife, not nature. And I should have kind of it should have sunk in, but it really never did. I still very much felt of myself that, I was 23. Death was something that happened to people. And logically, I understood that it would happen to me, but not that it really would happen to me, if you know what I mean. That kind of illusion that we do to ourselves, especially when it's something that we've got, the enlightened self-interest, right? I don't want to die. I don't know. Hopefully nobody out there wants to die. So that's a very uncomfortable fact to face. And so suddenly in August, the realization, all of it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I went from someone who was kind of muddling through on the spiritual front to all the whole house of cards came down. What was truth? What was real? Is there really a God? Did Jesus really exist at all? And if he did, how do we know that the claims that are made that are pretty spectacular, how do we know that those are, really real? As Alan said, I have a background in physics and math, and I would never in a million years claim to be a scientist. I be perfectly honest. I went went to classes on test days. I spent more time in the bar trying to find girls than ever studying for anything. But I was still, immersed in that culture where, the intellectual and the smart, intelligent people are all in the sciences, and they know better. And I was very susceptible and bought into the idea that over time, religiosity has decreased and the level of atheism and disbelief has increased, especially as we've found more scientific evidence for things. It's kind of made those God the gaps arguments really go away. And realistically, over the last 400 years, the place in God and society in our lives has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and is now sort of, pinioned into the corner of our lives, and it's begging for mercy, like just, leave me alone. I'll stay quiet just on Sunday, and otherwise I won't peep. And I bought into all of it, and so all of these doubts and fears came crashing down, and the term crisis of faith is not a misnomer. That is really what it's like, because something like, I wasn't raised in a very religious household. We were what I would call C&E Christians. We went to church on Christmas and Easter. No tithing or Bible study. I didn't even know what a Bible study was or is until I moved to Texas. And but like, my parents did and do believe in God. It just wasn't really a big part of my life. I even went with the Boy Scouts. I got the religious medal Adult every day. I taught Sunday school, which is insane, but I actually taught Sunday school when I was in high school. So at least to me, I checked the boxes, right? I'm going through life going like, man, I got my resume of my Christianhood, and look at all the stuff I got. I am a spiritual badass. And then, going through, but it was kind of a little bit fake it till you make it, because there were always these big questions hanging out down there. But I kind of felt like I was the only one, and you don't really vocalize that stuff. Looking around at church, I was the usher on aisle 3 at the 10:45, and looking around, everybody else seemed solid. So I was like, it's just me. I'll just keep going, doing what I'm doing, and everything will be fine. Well, it wasn't fine. So August hit, and man, I mean, like overnight, it was literally debilitating. So a little bit of the experience for someone who has never really gone through that level of doubt, it's like one of the major pieces of your life is just suddenly gone, right? So you start contemplating, what are your two choices? There's really two choices, right? Either God exists or God doesn't exist. There's really no God kind of exists. So it's Boolean, one or the other. So in the one narrative where I had been living, right, there's God and there's Jesus and there's heaven and hell and all that kind of good stuff that we've been taught. On the other side is the idea that, is all science-based, which we'll get into that in a little bit. But that one, there is no God. Right? Everything that we are, everything we see, everything that we think, everything that we do is all entirely based on natural process. There is only matter and energy there. And when it's easy to look at that and say, oh yeah, I can see how that sort of stuff came through. But when you start really looking at what are the ramifications of that? What does that really mean to your life? That's where it gets terrifying. So, I mean, probably the biggest thing was really kind of two pieces, and the most impactful was in that worldview. There is nothing else. Literally, you are born, you live, and then you die, and then you just cease to exist. Now, personally, I find that terrifying, and I admit that. And nothing that you do matters. Literally, no matter what, you could cure cancer, and it really doesn't matter. And there is that nihilism that it is all literally meaningless. And you really have to think about that for a little bit to let that seep in. You don't matter. Your children don't matter. Nothing you can possibly do matters. It doesn't matter if you're happy, sad, rich, poor. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. And you start looking at that, and it's kind of hard to find a point to get out of bed.
So you're saying, I mean, in one sense, I think you would say even if someone is an atheist, their kids matter. I mean, to them at that point in time. But you're taking the big long picture, right? You're saying, well, eventually everyone's going to die. No one's even going to remember you. It's the same ultimate destiny, and either no matter what you do. Is that kind of where you're coming from, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, and just to be clear, like as we go through this, like I'm way more towards the Christian side right now, but I'm not like, you know, a big evangelist or anything. And the other side is like, you know, I don't subscribe to the, you know, atheists are immoral or they don't love people or any of that. I mean, that, you know, there are good Christians, bad Christians, good atheists, bad atheists, right? I mean, people are people. I kind of feel like that's the way it all the way is across. But but what you're saying is exactly right. Is that in the atheist worldview that we're just matter and energy, and really, if you really go down to it, everything that we do is determinist, which means that everything that it's just a set of dominoes, right? We're not actually making any choices. Everything we're doing, and if anybody's listening to this and going, well, I don't believe that, look into it, because that's really what it means. When you're looking at just being matter and energy, the way that molecules and atoms and energy interact is going to dictate the next moment of time. And that is just pure fact. And so everything that you're doing has been predetermined. There's no such thing as choice. As such, there's no such thing as love. You don't love your children. You don't love your wife or your parents, right? You just have this evolved chemical process to simulate some sort of experiential feeling so that you will go and protect them. And that's really what it means. And I find, look, when I started this, I said there's a lot of really uncomfortable things here for me. And we'll certainly get into the things that are on the Christian side that I have a lot of problems with. But one thing I said from the beginning is that I'm gonna be as clinical as I humanly possibly can on both sides, because as much as I freely admit I want the Christian worldview to be true, I do. I do not think it is impossible, especially if you take great pains, to separate out your feeling from fact. And that goes on both sides of the aisle, because a lot of times you'll hear people, oh, this, you know, you're just blind faith, wishful thinking and all that. But it is absolutely true that it happens on both sides, not just from the Christian side. And one of those is when you're dealing with an atheist worldview is that realistically, you don't exist after the moment you die. 100 years from now, people are probably not going to remember who you are. 1,000 years ago, come on now. Do you remember who lived in 1500 or 300 BC? Maybe a couple names, right? Maybe. How about in 5,000 years? What do you think the odds are then? You know what? The end all be all is the universe is heading toward the heat death. And that means that all the usable energy has been used, and all that is going to exist is cold, diffuse matter. And believe me, those lifeless molecules are not going to give one hoot about you or me. And that's just the way it is. So if you look at it like in the atheist view, that worldview, man, there's no hope. Honestly speaking, there's no hope.
Yeah,
Can I ask?
Go ahead, Sean.
Well, Devin, I just wanted to kind of, we rushed over, you went over a little bit about this I don't know what you would call it, but this crisis moment, I believe you used that word, this crisis moment that you experienced. Now, would you say that was like a midlife crisis? Was it, were there events that triggered that crisis, or was it just like? I didn't
buy that, if that's what you're asking. Honestly, I get your point, Sean, and you know, I've done a lot of analysis on myself. Like, was this depression? Was this midlife crisis? Was it, you know, whatever? And you know, I think being honest, I think you could argue for some of that, right? I do. Coming up on 50, the 50 is a big milestone. You're seeing that like you're kind of 2/3 of the way through your life if you use average life expectancy for male in North America. Also, it's interesting. August is 2/3 of the way through the year to December, which, you know, my mind does work in those weird, I won't say mathematical, but those kind of weird mathematic flavored stuff. So yeah, I think you could make that argument, you know, but I don't think that it was just purely a manifestation of like midlife crisis. I think it could have been a perfect storm. I certainly would not dismiss that. But this taking hold, I think to be perfectly honest, you know, you see those movies where somebody goes up and, you know, claps their hand and the avalanche comes down with this gigantic tsunami of ice and snow. I think that's a little closer to what it was, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, wow. And so just listening to you raise some of these points, it really sounds like you were in some ways formulating a moral argument against like a naturalist atheistic worldview, because if God doesn't exist, then there are no values, there are no duties, there is no beauty and meaning and purpose, and so, but those things seem real, right? Those things seem real. The love that you have for anyone has for their family members, that seems like that, like that's a real thing. And in some ways, that's more real than anything else that you might experience.
Absolutely.
So it actually gives you reason to doubt the atheistic worldview, because it cannot account for your lived experience. Right. And it's interesting because that's actually one of the arguments that Dr. William Lane Craig, who's the founder of Reasonable Faith, gives. And it seems like you just kind of articulated that argument. I don't know if you were aware of that argument or were you just...
Well, you know, what was wild when I went through this, I have the benefit of working for myself. Alan said I've got my own software company, and so I have the freedom that for about a year and a half, I had the ability, thank goodness, to basically put everything on hold. Like I did my normal morning meetings, and then I was reading and watching videos, and I mean, and I get that most people don't really have that latitude to be able to do that. But I mean, so to answer your question, William Lane Craig was a huge resource for me. I've listened to podcasts, watched tons of videos. Gary Habermas. I mean, you know, I could spend an hour just going through the list of people. And in fairness, on the atheist side too. I mean, I went out to tons of atheist podcasts, and you know what? To your point, though, I find very interesting, and one of the things that really truly sold me on this, I was listening to an atheist podcast on free will, where they absolutely believed in deterministic worldview, and they started talking a little later on, and I'll spare you all the boring details. But they were talking about, you know, the idea that it's all determinist really should influence the way that we decide to go and set up the penals in the criminal justice system. And I immediately said, so you're going to decide to do that. And if it's determinist, how is your doing that going to change their behavior one bit? Explain that to me. Like I find it so consistent, how inconsistent that kind of stuff. It's almost hypocritical that they're saying, well, we're determinists, we have no choice, I'm not responsible for my actions. And then in the next hand, where it's more convenient, suddenly, well, we're going to decide to do this. Or it's like, no, I mean, you have to choose one and go with everything on that side. You can't just say it's not the poo-poo platter of life for those of you that like Chinese food where you pick column A and column B. It doesn't work like that. Like if you're going with the Christian worldview, there are those elements. If you're with the atheist worldview, there are those elements. And honestly, just be honest about it, right? Just be honest about it, because that's what it means.
It's really hard to live with that kind of atheist worldview or you end up having to deny these things that we all take to be true.
Well, and Sam Harris, the big proponent of all that. I saw an interview with him, and he could not bring himself to admit that he did not love his children. I'm like,
yeah.
If your flag bearer is out there and they can't even profess, for the things that the way you're saying reality works, that you can't even go and say that out loud. It makes it really hard for me to give it too much faith in that.
Yeah, those really are the logical implications. And I think with your physics background, it's easy for you to find those arguments persuasive. If physics is all there is, then how do you avoid this deterministic world? And Sam Harris and others argue that pretty persuasively, but they start with presuppositions of naturalism.
Yeah, with me in the science background, because it's embarrassing how little I studied. It was more along the lines of things that all the intellectual elite were atheists, and basically, you were intellectual elite, or you were a backwards hillbilly quoting Bible verses for things that you found uncomfortable in life and couldn't explain. Those were kind of the two deals. And one thing that helped me with that, if anybody else is seeing that as a problem, do a little research on the study that whole thing is based off of. It's like I think a 2005 study out of the University of Rochester, where they went and they looked at the study of religiosity and intelligence over the last 80 years. And when you start digging into the study, the end is that's the big claim for why the intelligent elite are atheists. When you dig in, it comes in, there's absolutely no correlation to intelligence for religious behaviors. And there's a 0.17 correlation for actual religious belief. And dig in a little deeper for all this, because there's a lot of really good meat there. But 0.17 is well within the margin of error for any study. So it's like, basically, even the study author said there really is no basis, but everybody uses that to go out. And so I had heard that a bunch, right? I don't want to be lumping myself in with the, backwoods. I don't like my sister that way. I don't want to be like those guys, that's no good, right? Sorry.
Hey, can you talk about different kinds of doubt? I've heard you mention some things that you found from Gary Habermas you thought were useful, and there may be some people watching this going through doubt, and there's some useful distinctions there that it would help probably for them to hear. Yeah,
and I'm gonna jump into something I was thinking about talking about towards the end, but I do want to say to make sure that people would hear is. If anybody's going through this, don't assume that everybody knows more than you. Don't assume that that you can't ask these questions, and don't assume that because this information has not been brought up before in wherever, that there aren't really good answers. And one of the ways that this manifested is I didn't know that a lot of people doubted, that it's a big thing. There's lots of people going through this. I also didn't know that there were multiple types of doubt. And Alan, you're right. It's Gary Habermas. I saw some of his videos out on YouTube. Go check him out. Habermas. And what he really talks about is there's really three types of doubt. So your first is your intellectual or logical doubt, which means that hey, they claim that this guy Jesus physically existed in Judea 2,000 years ago. How did that happen? How did Paul actually go and make these trips? How could that possibly be? So that you can go and actually do evidence-based, looking at answer the question, right? How is this possible? How is something like that? So more of a factual, clinical look at your doubt. I just plain old don't believe that, right? The next is emotional doubt, and I don't want to put words in Professor Habermas's mouth, because he knows it way better than I do, and I'm just trying to parrot this. But it's when you say, you get the answer to that, and you go, yeah, but what if, which, believe me, I am really, really good at, right? It's like, well, Jesus changed the world. Yeah, but what if he had, some wine in the cart out back? Like, I gotta be honest, when I was dating, I kept a couple bottles of wine in the back seat of my car because if the date was going really well, and you want to kind of keep it going, and I'd run out. I'd run out to the car and get the bottle of wine, and then the date keeps going. Maybe they were at the wedding, maybe they ran out of wine, and goes, all right, Jesus, you got the wine in the car, and you went out, and then over time it kind of evolved the mythification of it. So I could keep coming up with these scenarios. Is that based on anything? No. Is there any evidence for that? No. But that's how you kind of get the signs of having like the emotional doubt that like, you can always be like, yeah, I see what you're saying. And all the evidence says that you're right. And I've got no evidence at all for why it wouldn't be that. But still, right? So when you're doing that, you're in the world of emotional doubt, and I live there. Still do a little bit, but really solidly live there. And there's techniques you can get yourself, because that's not rational, right? The emotional doubt isn't rational, and you're never going to get an answer to that, because no matter what, you'll always get more stuff, right? There'll always be other things. So there's ways that you can get out of it, and so that you look at things in a more clinical way to say, do I believe this or not? Right? Because if you play it just on the emotional side, you're never going anywhere. So the third type of doubt is a volitional doubt, meaning like, that's great, I don't want to believe it. And there's plenty of people that do that too. If I decide to be a Christian, then I really can't, have my, party with this girl that I know when, my wife is out of town. And so I don't want to believe it. Right. And a lot of times there is some behavior that someone doesn't want to give up for that. And that, that one, as I understand it, is, that one you just, if you don't want to change, then you're making a choice.
You had a lot of intellectual doubt, and probably because you had this existential crisis, there was some emotional doubt as well. But I don't think in your case, the volitional doubt came in much, because you're not looking for an escape to, avoid the cosmic authority or anything. So
no, I was kind of the opposite. I was hoping it was true, but the other side is I wasn't gonna pretend that something was true if I looked at all the evidence and it didn't hold up, right? I just can't do that. That just would never work for me. And there's some people that can do that, and they don't care, and that's what they want to believe, and that's what they'll do. Good for them, I guess. It makes them have a happier life. They don't go through a couple of years of this stuff, So I mean, hey, I can't look down my nose at them, because they're out going to the beach and having a grand old time, while I'm watching YouTube videos at 3 o'clock in the morning, freaking out because maybe God doesn't exist. So, who's better? I don't know.
Well, I think God does call us to have a reasonable faith. I think that's a biblical concept. We're not supposed, no one's asked to just kind of fake it or force themselves. They should seek answers.
Yeah, J. Warner Wallace, who's a big-time apologist for anyone who doesn't know, actually, I think he's dead on where they need to, the word faith has been corrupted, over time to mean blind faith, right? So believing without evidence or anything, it's just, we all know what blind faith is. But his point was, is active trust, right? That's his thing, is active trust. And I think that's really what it is. Because, one of the things, and I think I'm going off the rails a little bit here, is that this was kind of amazing to me. Like, we talk about what we know. And I always wanted to know that God was real, right? I wanted to know, like 100%, put him in the test tube, do my test, comes out, I do the spectrometer. Man, there we go. I've done it 100 times. I got the 100 results. I am dead. This is great. I am 100%. And the reality of life is there's only one thing that you actually know, and that is that you exist. And that sounds like some kind of nerdy, whatever, esoteric, crazy thought, but it's really the truth, right? We've all watched and loved The Matrix, at least those of us above the age of like 35. But like that idea is like, when you think about it, it's just electrical impulses or stimuli in your brain. The reality is that we have all of this stuff that happens around us. Like, do we know that someone landed on the moon? Do you? Like, well, I don't know. I wasn't there. But I've seen the evidence, right? I know the mathematics and physics around it. I've seen the footage. There's more than enough for me to believe that we landed on the moon. But I don't know, right? So there's only a certain percentage of certainty, and then you have to have that faith, that trust to bridge that gap. So the things that we say we're certain of, that little chasm is smaller, and the things that we're not so certain of, it's bigger. And it got me to the point that I accepted the fact that I will, as hard as it is, and as crazy as, and as the opposite that I have always been taught, I will never truly, until I die, I will never truly know if God exists, right? But I need to get to the level of certainty that my trust can carry me over that. So that's where all of the rest of this comes in, right? The experiential, the apologetics, the moral arguments, the logic and philosophy, all of that. That's where it all comes in, to like build the spans on the bridge. So that little piece you can just step over instead of seeing a mighty chasm that you're never going to get across.
Yeah, maybe we should transition into talking a bit about this evidence. I know you don't want people thinking, this was all an emotional experience for you. Obviously, you did a lot of study, more than most would have even had time for. But let's talk a bit about maybe what is an example of evidence you found compelling for God, and then after that we can talk through the contrary, something maybe that you're still struggling a bit with.
And before you mention that, Devin, I did have a follow-up response to the knowledge. My background is in philosophy. I'm a philosopher, and it's interesting because a point that you just raised is a very deeply philosophical problem, and it's the problem of knowledge. They call it epistemology. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that, the science of epistemology, where they attempt to define what is knowledge. Now, an interesting perspective of knowledge is that knowledge entails or involves or includes certainty, right? That you can't know something unless you're completely certain. And that view of knowledge, many philosophers today kind of reject as not a very practical view of knowledge, because if knowledge involves certainty, then the things that we know begin to we know almost next to nothing. Because science, let's take, for example, evolution. Evolution is a theory that is established based off of observation based off of present observations, right? So we try to scientists try to reconstruct what happened in the past on the basis of what they can observe presently. And that's an abductive method. But since we can't observe the past directly, then that means that no conclusion that we could come to about the past could ever be considered knowledge, if knowledge included certainty. So that definition of knowledge actually even undermines science, and it undermines everything. And Rene Descartes was very influential with the "I think, therefore I exist." The cogito ergo sum. I can doubt everything, but I can't doubt my own existence, because once I do that, it's still me that's doing the doubting. And if I'm doing the doubting, then that means that I have to be here to do. So the doubting proves my own existence, and so I just think. It's interesting because another philosopher, one of the greatest, many will say is the greatest living philosopher of religion within the past probably 100 years, and that's Alvin Plantinga. And Alvin Plantinga began, he wrote a book in his early years called God and Other Minds. And in that book, he basically critiques Aquinas's five waves. his different arguments for the existence of God, and he does this brutal, rigorous analysis and almost just completely destroys all of the arguments and concludes that many of them don't work at all. But that then he critiques the atheistic arguments and say, well, those don't work either. Yeah. So what do we do? He says, well, we have this belief. We can be justified in certain beliefs with wholly apart from argument, such as like I'm speaking to you, and I think that you have a mind, but you could be like some well-developed robot that has the appearance. But we are warranted in believing that when we see certain effects that in inferring a cause, even though we're not certain about that cause, and we are justified in believing that. And so it's not as strong as argument as we would like. Many times we want mathematical certainty, where we can, even it's a contradiction if I reject it, but it's still a useful and what I try to do is I don't want to have a standard of knowledge that I don't use in my life, right? I'm confident in knowing that my car is outside because when I looked, it was there, right? So, I mean, it could be gone, but I don't have any reason to think that it's gone. So I have more reason to think that it is outside. So I'm confident with that knowledge. So some people have looked at certainty as a emotional state, right? Because you can have knowledge apart from certainty. Like I can know something even though I'm not certain about it. So certainty is more of a subjective a piece about what you believe, and it's not really in the things themselves. Certainty is something that is within our subjectivity. So, but that was just the what I wanted to follow up with that comment. But I really am interested in hearing any thoughts and then what evidence it was that brought you to this view and helped you to shake some of that doubt.
Well, and that, Sean, but I'm just going to touch on what you just said. I had never really considered that certainty really is subjective, and it really is. And I'm going to have to give some thought to that later on or this weekend, because that's that I think is important. I really do. Mm-hmm. By the way, for anybody out there, you're going to have to pardon me with this, Sean. I grew up in the physical sciences. And my respect for philosophy was pretty much at a 0.0. It was mental BS games by guys in an ivory tower, like doing these things that nothing matter for crap for anybody in the real world. But as I got into it, and now it is extremely powerful. Like I'm a little dense. It took me a while to figure out. It's just using logic to solve problems. And maybe not physical problems, but it's using logic. And what could be bad about that? And philosophy, for anybody who watches this, like, spend some time on it. It's really good stuff. It really, really is powerful. So
you can't even do science without philosophy. I mean, ultimately, you have to have a philosophy of science to make progress.
Yeah, but it's always shunned, right? It's always the experimental or even the theoretical that really gets all the massive attention. That's not, but anyway, we could go on and talk about that.
Good point.
So a couple of things. So when I was going through this journey, what I really found interesting was that, first of all, like I probably started out with 3, 4, 5 major issues or areas that I wanted to explore more. But as I went out, I found that there are a lot of various topics. Like I didn't even consider the philosophical stuff, and there's tons out there. And there's so it kept it kept growing, right? And what I found, and by the way, what I found, which was a little ego bruising, is that I wasn't the first brilliant person to think up all this stuff. People have been debating these things for at least 2,000 years. And for a lot of the Old Testament stuff, like 3,500, literally debating back and forth, right? So there have been apologists. I wasn't the first one to think of, whatever it was. and people have been having rational conversation and debate for a lot of these. And honestly, one thing I found as I was going through is a lot of the topics had been debunked hundreds of years ago. So it's not even like somebody didn't get the message because they figured out the answer to this last November. It was like hundreds of years ago has been debunked, but it's still promoted because it sounds great. It's a pithy little soundbite. And that honestly I found infuriating, because I was in a bad emotional state, right? My world had collapsed. I'm desperately, I'm like, thank God I never thought of any drastic bad stuff, but I'm like looking into a vortex of nothingness, going like, how can I even encourage my kids to be more when it doesn't matter? And I'm going through this and spending hours upon hours and just obsessively going through this, and people are promoting things that because they sound nice on a bumper sticker, but have absolutely no meat. Well, if God is all powerful, how, well, I'm sorry, I'm bastardizing it. If God is good, how can there be evil? And if God is powerful, the whole Epicurus deal, and I mean all of these different these different things that are, frankly, they're bogus. I was going one night, and I went. I don't even remember. A lot of times you're kind of surfing. You're going from one thing and you see this, and you know how that goes, right? And so I get to this site, and it's talking about a savior from long ago, had 12 disciples, worshipped on the day of the sun, had a Eucharist, raised a guy named Lazarus from the dead, born of a virgin with the shepherds, and so on and so on, and all this stuff. And then it turns out that it's actually it was actually an old Egyptian god. That Jesus Christ was a recycled version of the Mithras, right? Which actually he was in Persia, but then they did one in Egypt as well. And the only reason it came over to Rome is because it was carried back by the Roman soldiers. And so I'm looking at it going like, if this is true, Christianity is a joke, right? I mean, because that's the thing, is the premise is that the people there were looking for a savior to fight back against the Roman Empire, and so they had this Mithras with all these things. So they just repackaged it as Jesus Christ, and away we go. And that also explains how it became so popular in Rome. And it was scary. Like the pit of my stomach was like, because if that was true, put forth by PhDs and all that, like, this whole thing is just a sham, right? Put together in the Council of Nicaea and all that kind of stuff. But then I started doing some more digging, and it turns out, like, man, the whole thing is you know what? I'll save the suspense. Go and look up the Mithras, because like none of that is true. It's just fully promoted. And my whole point on this was, I go around for 15 minutes on that. The whole point is that so many of these ideas and concepts are promoted as rock solid, absolute truths that are like a couple quacks putting together like stuff on basically extrapolating off of almost no real information and putting forth things that would be like, but you read it and it's going like, holy crap, it's like all the kids in college. They've got the gray-haired professor telling them all the reasons why the Bible is just been, changed over time to promote these ideas, right? And there's nobody on the other side. And that's why I don't understand the church. I'll be perfectly honest. I don't understand the church doesn't do anything to let their flock know about any of this, because it's like I went through all my religious stuff as a Catholic youth, right? I taught religious school. I got the religious medal, all this stuff. I should be somebody that actually has a clue on this. And it really turns out I have no clue, none whatsoever. Anyway, so.
Hey, quick comment on that ties in with what you were saying before. This is an example where, the church should be talking about these kinds of copycat theories. It shouldn't be that someone encounters it for the first time watching Zeitgeist on the internet or something like that.
That's it.
And then you were talking about things that were debunked long ago. This is in that category. Well over 100 years ago, when these things first started popping up, like in the 19th century, a number of secular scholars, they studied it some more, and they finally just said, yeah, this has no basis at all. But then it was, resurrected in this slick video with all these footnotes.
Right.
It turns
Sounds
out
legit.
House of Cards.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like there's a bunch that are, just easily defeatable, that I find it inexcusable that the church doesn't go out and release your tool. Now there's some hard ones, right? So you were asking earlier about like what I found compelling for the side of God. I'd have to say that the moral argument in free will is one of the bigger ones, because really there's only two choices. It's determinist or free will, right? Libertarian free will, if we want to be technical. Determinist, come on. I just like, we can go into all about, but there's nothing. There's nothing that would lead me to believe, not even in experiential evidence. There's nothing to lead me to believe that we're determinists at all. There's besides it being somebody's idea, I see absolutely no evidence for that. So the moral, and I do know I love my kids. I do, and my wife. Sorry, honey, I didn't mean to list you last. Got myself in trouble. So there's that, and then amazingly enough, it was the science that actually gave me a big bolstering to my belief side. So and a couple of pieces on that is, first of all, like in my world, when I hear supernatural, some supernatural experience, right? So what I think of is, I think of Scooby-Doo, where they're at the mansion and there's these eerie stuff going on, and the guy comes out, I would have gone away with it too, meddling kids, right? That's their supernatural, right? That anybody could really explain away. But the reality is that in the beginning, sorry, I had to use that pun, but before the Big Bang, there was literally nothing. And so I'm not going to try to explain what nothing is, because I don't think anybody really truly understands what it is. So we all think of big blank space, right? So in the beginning of Star Trek, that's not nothing. That has 3 dimensions. So nothing is literally nothing. It's, it's what rocks dream about, right? I think that was Socrates. So before anything, there was nothing, and then suddenly there was the Big Bang. And so in a moment, there was all the energy expressed as heat and light to go and convert into everything that we have in the entire universe. That was even entirely too slow. And so natural means things from a natural process, right? Things going on, interaction of atoms and chemicals and forces and all that kind of good stuff. Well, when there's nothing, how can you have forces? How can you have atoms? You don't. So the reality is that was above nature. It was supernatural by definition. And that was kind of a big moment of satori, a big aha for me, like, holy crap, not only is supernatural kind of something that, intellectually could happen, supernatural actually did happen. It absolutely is a real thing. And then following on is the fine-tuning argument. That was really compelling for me. Yeah,
can you talk a bit about the fine-tuning argument? And I guess maybe for those who are not familiar, what is fine-tuning?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is evidence for God.
It's really neat. And so the idea is, at that moment of the Big Bang, all of the energy in the universe was expressed as light and heat. And so from that moment, it was like a gigantic set of dominoes of all the things cascading into the next for everything to come together. And the initial, so at a high level, the fine-tuning argument is that the initial conditions, the constant 20 or so constants that are the underpinning everything in the way our reality works, all came together to work just right, so that the the expansion and creation of the universe moved at the proper speed, density, and force so that it would all exist and create a life-permitting universe. And so when you go into these things, well, first of all, like my perception was the Big Bang was like this little tiny point, and out of it streamed like the universe, and the little planets got bigger as they came out, right? That's great from my big physics background, because it was completely wrong, not even remotely right. So it was just this massive explosion of light and heat. Basically, if all of these things did not happen within the narrow window, the parameters were not set within the narrow window, we would not have a life-permitting universe. So let's talk about, I call it a disastrous universe. And what I mean by that isn't like, maybe people would look like squids, or we'd be silicon-based or something like that. It doesn't mean that. So when I say disastrous universe, what I mean is that atoms would not have formed, because the electrons, your particles would be too far apart. It would be so diffuse. There's no way that an atom would form. Or the gravity was wrong, so everything would be just black holes. Or it expanded too slow, and the universe would have collapsed instead of a big bang, and I call it the big crunch. So it would have been, because when it's expanding out, it has to be going at the speed that it can overcome slightly the force of the gravity pulling it back in. So it needs to go just at the right speed. And so what are we talking about? And by the way, there's no theology here, right? This is pure physics. So atheist, Buddhist, Christian, every physicist agrees with all this. And these are not theoretical. These are actually measured quantities. So there's no mystery or debate on any of this. And a great book for those of you that are looking to dig a little deeper in this is a book called Fortunate Universe. Fortunately, it's in my car. I should have had it here and give them a free, maybe I get a dime on every sale. But it's by, there it's got it was written by a Christian and an atheist. And so most of the book, all the way through up to the point of the conclusions, it's all straight physics. And I got to admit, some of it's kind of more hardcore physics. I had to spend probably, for every minute I spent reading the book, I probably spent 5 minutes going and researching the stuff that I should have learned in college, but I didn't. So some of those ideas, things like the gravitational force constant, right? So that's like keeping me in my chair, keeping the planets together and all that kind of stuff. So the window of how precise it had to be set is that if it was 1 in 10 to the 36th weaker, it wouldn't have worked, or 10 to the 40th stronger, we'd only have black holes. So what does that mean? That goes to exponents. So anybody out there who doesn't have that, when you're dealing with an exponent, all it means, 10 to the 36th, all it means is the number of zeros. So if I had 10 to the third, it would be 1 with 3 zeros. So 10 to the third is 1,000, right? 10 to the sixth is 1,000,000, so on and so forth. So now we're talking about the window of permissible, and you could have had a very wide range of values that are possible. You're talking about the window that it has to be in is between 10 to the 36. So 1 with 36 zeros. Think about that. And then to the other side, that 10 to 36, and then 10 to the 40th, it's got a skinny right in there. Now, the big thing is that if it was just 1 constant, you'd be like, well, we got lucky. Hey, if somebody wins the lottery all the time, big deal. The problem is there's over 20 of these constants. And the other side is, when you look at that, you have to multiply the probabilities. If you're looking at it from a purely chance perspective, you have to multiply them out, which I didn't bother doing the math, but let's just say it's really big. So to put it in perspective, using the number 10 to the 36, and that's always a challenge, I think. We people who are comfortable in the sciences or math, they throw around numbers in like 10 to the 36 and 10 to the 70th. And when I hear 10 to 36, I hear 36, right? big deal. 36, not that big of a deal. If it was 1 out of 36, that's roughly, well, let's see, that's like a 3% chance. That's not what it means at all. It means 1 with 36 zeros. So what does that really mean in real life? So let's say that let's say that it was a purely accidental that it fell in this window. So it would be like me sitting down with you playing poker, right? So, and on the first hand, I get a royal flush, right? So royal flush being the sequence of 10, Jack, Queen, King, Ace of a specific suit. So I sit down, we're playing. Sean, I got my first royal flush. You congratulate me. You're pissed that I just won. And honestly, I used to play in a weekly card game. I've never gotten a royal flush. Anyway, so we sit down. The next hand, guess what I get? A royal flush. Are you believing that? So keep in mind, the odds of a royal flush is roughly 1 in 650,000, right? So, okay, third hand, you're kind of not feeling good about it. I got another royal flush. At this point, are you believing that this game is rigged, or are you thinking that it's just, well, it's possible, right? Somebody's got to get a royal flush. Why not me? Right? Right? So, how about the fourth? Now, if there's anybody ever that sees this video and said, yes, I would still believe it, please, my contact information will be there. I'd like to invite you to the weekly card game. And there's no maximum stakes. So bring all your money, because we're gonna have a great time. So we get to the 5th, 6th, 7th royal flush in a row. And then, by the way, that gets pretty close to 10 to the 36, but as Alan calculated for me, we got to take care of the rounding on that, so it also had to be on a Tuesday. So you had to get 7 royal flushes in a row on a Tuesday to get to 10 to the 36. And that's one of them, right? One of them. So, I mean, there's like I said, there's 20, and that's the thing is when you start getting into what 10 to the 36 means, 10 to the 40th, and by the way, those are some of the more modest ones. It kind of like, I don't know, it blew my mind. Right? I won't spend a ton of time going on this stuff, but gravitational, gravity fraction weaker. So, oh, by the way, the 10 to the 40th on the gravity being weaker, that is 1,000 times more precise, than 7 royal flushes on a Tuesday. That's the other side of that window. So one way of look at it also is take a tape measure, run it across the entire galaxy, and your range of acceptable values that this universe works is 1 inch wide. That's it. Anywhere else, it doesn't work. And I'm not going to belabor the point. I like to go into this because, people, when you're talking about the fine-tuning arguments, they throw out the numbers at 10 to the 80th and 10 to the whatever. And I don't know about anybody else, but they would just wash over me like, wow, that sounds like a big number. But it didn't really resonate with me on what that really means. So that I think is really a big challenge, for people to understand this, and not just, I mean, everybody, myself included. Cosmological constant, which set the speed of the expansion of the universe, had to be accurate to 1 in 10 to the 90th. The ratio of electrons to protons, both in number and mass, had to be 10 to the 37th. Electromagnetic force to gravity ratio had to be 10 to the 40th. So again, like if these are not in those precise ranges, it's not like things aren't the way we expect them. They just don't work at all, right? Atoms don't exist, or we're all in black holes.
Lots of ways yeah, the key is that it's even any kind of structure formation. So,
yeah, that's it, right? It's not life as we know it. And that's at that atheist book club, when brought up, life as we know it. It's not life as we know it, is that there's no chemistry, or there is nothing. It doesn't exist. And I'll just share with you my favorite one of these constants is basically when Big Bang happened, the amount of energy that was released to be able to use to build everything, right? Equals mc squared, so you can convert energy to mass, blah, 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 all that kind of great stuff. If the amount was different by the amount of mass in any human being. But the amount was different in my mass, the universe wouldn't work. If you added me or took me away from those initial conditions, the universe wouldn't work. Think about everything in the entire universe, how much mass there is. Now, I've gained a couple pounds, but not that much. So, I mean, it just kind of blows me away that like it gets down to that tiny amount of precision.
Let me ask you a question about these constants. So these are measurements. Is that correct? These are measurements?
The constants are what drive the way everything is created. So they're measurable, and they are the same value and always have been the same value. There's no variation on them.
So, like if you were to measure weight, something's weight, you would put it on a scale. Right. What is the device that physicists use to measure like these constants? Is that, do we know what that is, or are they using math? And
well, I mean, some of that is based on the speed of light, and I like, how do they actually get down to what those numbers are? I'd have to look that up.
Okay.
Alan, do you have anything on that?
It'd be a different answer for every constant.
For everyone, yeah.
And is that we're dealing with science at its most fundamental level, and you have these particles that cannot be decomposed further. I mean, you can take a proton, you can split it into quarks, but as far as we know, the quark itself is the lowest level. And then you can look at properties in terms of its mass and its charge. And it turns out that if you were to have changed those masses just a little bit, then you don't even have things like stable atoms. You can't build structure.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of ways in which the universe just looks incredibly rigged.
And which constant is that? Is it like a quark constant, or where the mass of these?
Like one of the examples you'll see in that book that Devin mentioned, Fortunate Universe, is they have like a 3-dimensional diagram where they're looking at the electron mass and the mass of the up and down quark, and they're looking at the parameter, kind of viewing within this 3-dimensional space defined by these 3 different parameters, where is the life permitting region? And then they'll start talking about, well, here's one possible disaster, and it slices off a big part of that.
Uh-oh.
And then you have another one that goes, different direction, and the universe is unlivable if it were to be true that, you had a certain different ratio of the masses of those quarks and things like that. And you end up with literally what looks like a razor's edge that's also in that same kind of category to Devin's examples of something like 10 to the 32 to 36, somewhere in that range of the fraction of parameter space that's life permitting is just 1 in 10 to the 30 something power, which is pretty mind-boggling. And then you just encounter more of those. The cosmological constant, as Devin mentioned, it's far worse than that at 1 in 10 to the 90th, using a really conservative estimate. And
I think
differ by more than that, the universe would have been flying apart, not right away, but it would have expanded quickly enough to stop structure formation within, literally like a day. So there's no way you would ever form atoms, much less planets or people or anything like that.
Yeah, think about each particle, each electron being like a distance of a couple of light years from the next one. They would never get together to actually form atoms or anything like that. And I think that graph that Alan was talking about, if I recall it correctly, it was basically like playing lawn darts. And the place you had to hit was, I think, a couple inches by a couple inches, but the field was a couple of light years wide and tall. That's the side. That's
wow.
Yeah, that's a pretty small target.
Yeah, they have to draw logarithmic space, because otherwise it would take light years of space just to show this huge graph and be able to identify the emitting region.
And so to argue against this, people are always saying, well, what, it's kind of like what's the probability of all of these things? It's all these, imagine dials on these super precision. They all have to be set exactly right. And they go, well, probability is 1 because we're here and we observe it. And it's kind of like, that's not really very persuasive to me. It's kind of like you probably heard the idea of like, well, what if you're in North Korea and you say something bad against the grand leader, and they put you out there and bring out the firing squad, and there's 50 guys, and you hear big boom, and you're surprised that you're still alive, and you're like, oh, okay. And then another one comes out and they all miss. And how many groups are going to come out before you say, well, I'm alive to observe it, so they must not have been able to shoot me? Who would believe that? Or be like, well, there's some reason that it's not exactly happening that way. And that's what really it comes down to, right? There's only really 3 choices why things are. There are very few people, even hardcore atheists, that will deny these fine-tuning arguments are so compelling. And there's only really 3 ways to deal with it, right? There's physical necessity, chance, or intention, right? Mm-hmm. So physical necessity, all of these constants had to be the values that they are. There's no evidence for that. Some people plead to unknown knowledge. Appeals to unknown knowledge are really not very compelling, but you can do that if you want. We're going to figure something out in 10 years that'll say that this was all baloney and they really had to be that way. Well,
the atheist physicists themselves reject that. Like Mark says, it would still be fortuitous that the constants just happen to have the life permitting values. So it's not a good explanation.
No, not at all, right? To appeal to unknown knowledge or hidden knowledge is never a good explanation, right? You got to play the cards you're dealt. You got to deal with what you know. The next one is that no matter how unlikely something is, if you have an infinite number of chances, eventually you're gonna hit it, right? So and then comes up the multiverse, right? The multiverse theory, where there's this infinite or vast assemblage of universes, and there's some really impressive names in physics that are behind this idea. But every time it comes up, I cringe a little bit because there's zero evidence, and there's some guys that know. They've forgotten more physics than I'll ever know, and they're behind it. But I look at it going, there's absolutely no basis. It's more of an emotional, to me, fighting back against this, and not even an intuitive sense to argument on this. And honestly, the only way that there's no way you could ever experience it. You could never experiment to get it, and what's wild is the only way that you can make it work mathematically is if you add in additional dimensions into that. There's these hidden dimensions that either existed during Planck time, which is that first tiny fraction of a second in time before we can measure, or are hidden in our experience. And it just kind of blows me away that somebody would really go behind that. And to me, my opinion is just they don't like the implications of the fine-tuning part of it. Actually, Robert Penrose, if you've ever heard his name, he worked with Stephen Hawking on a lot of his stuff. He very well-known mathematician, physicist. He actually just won the Nobel Prize for physics in 2020. He said,
wow,
theory, it's a collection of hopes, because there's really nothing to it. Also the fact that the multiverse theory predicts parameters that would be less finely tuned. So the universe, in short, the universe that we experience is actually evidence against the multiverse theory, both from the amount of heat and energy that we've got, as well as the rest of parameters. So, and the only thing that's left, and I know we're probably running a little long, the only thing that's really left, if it's not necessity and it's not just random chance, well, it's intention. And if it's intention, well, then it implies, there's some kind of design, right? And if there's a design, there's got to be a designer. And this designer has got to really be more intelligent than we can possibly comprehend to factor in all of these things. And I'm sure we haven't even experienced it, but all the ones that we know about has to be super powerful, because he was actually able to make it, right? Not just think of it, he was actually able to make it timeless because they existed before time didn't come into being till, some fraction of a second after the Big Bang. And there's good evidence that this universe was created and unfolded with the intention for there to be life. There's a lot of compelling evidence to that. So you'd have to say that it's personal as well. And this got me completely out of the atheist boat. Like that was now like cross off. I just can't go there. This to me crosses off the atheist. I could see at this point it doesn't get you to Christian God, but I think it at least gets you to deist, right? That there is a God, and then you have to take that and start looking at all the evidences for all of the things in the New Testament, and all of that, and evaluate. Now there is a God. What flavor are we talking about from there?
Yeah, it's a great summary of fine tuning. Sean, do we need to wrap it up, or do we have time to explore maybe one of the issues that Devin might find challenging for belief in God?
Well, I don't know about you guys. I've enjoyed this conversation today, and I wouldn't mind coming back to do a part 2 to where we focus strictly on those objections, because Devin's Safeway actually was really his segue was actually perfect to be continued. Let me see if I can put that on the screen now. But that was a perfect segue into like looking at the Christian God. And I think if you guys don't mind, we can just schedule some time to come back and focus on that in the part 2, because this is a lot to really think about and digest. And I'm pretty sure we got a comment from one of the viewers earlier. They said this is great because, doubt is something that we all experience. And we from time to time, even Alvin Planting, I was reading him one day, and he was saying that sometimes even he has doubts. When he wakes up in the middle of the night and he thinks to himself, can this story be true? Can this it's so good. The story of the resurrection and the story of the fall of the world into sin. Can all of this be true? And it was dramatic the way he mentions that story, but we all experience doubt. And I think one thing about your story, Devin, that is very encouraging is that you're a seeker. You're searching for truth. You say, I want to know what it is, even if it's ugly, even if I won't like it, I'm going to look into it. And it was comforting to me when I learned as a Christian that I was kind of always this way. I'm like, I want to believe what is true, right? So if this isn't true, do I really want to live my life believing it, something that's not true? But I was so comforted to find, like as you were, that man, there are thousands and thousands of years worth of thinkers who have been critically thinking about their faith. So this isn't something where you have to separate, your heart, your faith in your heart from your mind, and you have to keep those, never the twain shall meet. You can have a rational, a reasonable, a faith that is based on evidence and even the insight of people like Alvin Planting is that our experience is even evidence for our beliefs, because he says if someone was to ask him what did he eat for breakfast this morning, he's not going to give them a syllogism. Either it was cornflakes or Cheerios. It wasn't Cheerios, therefore it was corn. He's going to recall with his memory. It seems to me, and then I recall myself eating, this type of breakfast. And he says that is a basic belief, because the belief is formed through his cognitive mechanisms operating and functionally normal within their context, typical context, and they were designed to give him truth. And so that any beliefs that are formed on that basis are properly basic. So I just thank you you all for tuning in, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. And we'll end the broadcast now. Remember, we've been joined with Mr. Alan Hainline and Mr. Devin, and I'm Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder. And remember to always think better.